friends, I'm Ellie. Welcome to Cardboard Design. Today, I will continue to tell you meaningful fairy tales. It will bring us valuable lessons about life. Let's listen. The first fairy tale, The Skillful Huntsman. There was once a young fellow who had learned the trade of locksmith and told his father he would now go out into the world and seek his fortune.
Very well,
Said the father,
I am quite content with that.
and gave him some money for his journey. So he traveled about and looked for work. After a time he resolved not to follow the trade of locksmith anymore, for he no longer liked it, but he took a fancy for hunting. Then there met him in his rambles a huntsman dressed in green, who asked whence he came and whither he was going. The youth said he was a locksmith's apprentice, but that the trade no longer pleased him, and he had a liking for huntsmanship. Would he teach it to him?
Oh, yes,
Said the huntsman.
if thou wilt go with me.
Then the young fellow went with him, bound himself to him for some years, and learned the art of hunting. After this he wished to try his luck elsewhere, and the huntsman gave him nothing in the way of payment but an air gun, which had, however, this property, that it hit its mark without fail whenever he shot with it. Then he set out and found himself in a very large forest, which he could not get to the end of in one day. When evening came, he seated himself in a high tree in order to escape from the wild beasts. Towards midnight, it seemed to him as if a tiny little light glimmered in the distance. Then he looked down through the branches towards it, and kept well in his mind where it was. But in the first place he took off his hat and threw it down in the direction of the light, so that he might go to the hat as a mark when he had descended. Then he got down and went to his hat, put it on again, and went straight forwards. The farther he went, the larger the light grew, and when he got close to it he saw that it was an enormous fire, and that 3 giants were sitting by it, who had an ox on the spit, and were roasting it. Presently one of them said,
I must just taste if the meat will soon be fit to eat.
and pulled a piece off, and was about to put it in his mouth when the huntsman shot it out of his hand.
Well, really,
Said the giant,
if the wind has not blown the bit out of my hand.
and helped himself to another. But when he was just about to bite into it, the huntsman again shot it away from him. On this the giant gave the one who was sitting next him a box on the ear, and cried angrily,
Why art thou snatching my piece away from me?
I have not snatched it away.
Said the other.
A sharpshooter must have shot it away from there.
The giant took another piece, but could not, however, keep it in his hand, for the huntsman shot it out. Then the giant said,
That must be a good shot to shoot the bit out of one's very mouth. Such an one would be useful to us.
and he cried aloud,
Come here, thou sharpshooter. Seat thyself at the fire beside us, and eat thy fill. We will not hurt thee. But if thou wilt not come, and we have to bring thee by force, thou art a lost man.
On this the youth went up to them and told them he was a skilled huntsman, and that whatever he aimed at with his gun, he was certain to hit. Then they said if he would go with them he should be well treated. And they told him that outside the forest there was a great lake, behind which stood a tower, and in the tower was imprisoned a lovely princess, whom they wished very much to carry off.
Yes,
Said he.
I will soon get her for you.
Then they added,
But there is still something else. There is a tiny little dog which begins to bark directly anyone goes near, and as soon as it barks, everyone in the royal palace wakens up, and for this reason we cannot get there. Canst thou undertake to shoot it dead?
Yes,
Said he.
that will be a little bit of fun for me.
After this he got into a boat and rowed over the lake, and as soon as he landed, the little dog came running out and was about to bark, but the huntsman took his air gun and shot it dead. When the giants saw that, they rejoiced, and thought they already had the king's daughter saved, but the huntsman wished first to see how matters stood, and told them that they must stay outside until he called them. Then he went into the castle, and all was perfectly quiet within, and everyone was asleep. When he opened the door of the first room, a sword was hanging on the wall which was made of pure silver, and there was a golden star on it, and the name of the king, and on a table near it lay a sealed letter which he broke open. And inside it was written that whosoever had the sword could kill everything which opposed him. So he took the sword from the wall, hung it at his side, and went onwards, Then he entered the room where the king's daughter was lying sleeping, and she was so beautiful that he stood still and, holding his breath, looked at her. He thought to himself,
How can I give an innocent maiden into the power of the wild giants who have evil in their minds?
He looked about further, and under the bed stood a pair of slippers. On the right one was her father's name with a star, and on the left her own name with a star. She wore also a great neck kerchief of silk embroidered with gold, and on the right side was her father's name, and on the left her own, all in golden letters. Then the huntsman took a pair of scissors and cut the right corner off, and put it in his knapsack. And then he also took the right slipper with the king's name, and thrust that in. Now the maiden still lay sleeping, and she was quite sewn into her nightdress, and he cut a morsel from this also, and thrust it in with the rest, but he did all without touching her. Then he went forth and left her lying asleep undisturbed. And when he came to the gate again, the giants were still standing outside waiting for him, and expecting that he was bringing the princess. But he cried to them that they were to come in, for the maiden was already in their power, that he could not open the gate to them, but there was a hole through which they must creep. Then the first approached, and the huntsman wound the giant's hair round his hand, pulled the head in, and cut it off at one stroke with his sword, and then drew the rest of him in. He called to the second and cut his head off likewise, and then he killed the third also, and he was well pleased that he had freed the beautiful maiden from her enemies, and he cut out their tongues and put them in his knapsack. Then thought he,
I will go home to my father and let him see what I have already done, and afterwards I will travel about the world. The luck which God is pleased to grant me will easily find me.
But when the king in the castle awoke, he saw the three giants lying there dead. So he went into the sleeping room of his daughter, awoke her, and asked who could have killed the giants. Then said she,
Dear father, I know not, I have been asleep.
But when she arose and would have put on her slippers, the right one was gone, and when she looked at her neck kerchief it was cut, and the right corner was missing, and when she looked at her nightdress a piece was cut out of it. The king summoned his whole court together, soldiers and everyone else who was there, and asked who had set his daughter at liberty and killed the giants. Now it happened that he had a captain, who was one-eyed and a hideous man, and he said that he had done it. Then the old king said that as he had accomplished this, he should marry his daughter. But the maiden said,
Rather than marry him, dear father, I will go away into the world as far as my legs can carry me.
But the king said that if she would not marry him, she should take off her royal garments and wear peasant's clothing, and go forth, and that she should go to a potter, and begin a trade in earthen vessels. So she put off her royal apparel, and went to a potter and borrowed crockery enough for a stall, and she promised him also that if she had sold it by the evening, she would pay for it. Then the king said she was to seat herself in a corner with it and sell it, and he arranged with some peasants to drive over it with their carts, so that everything should be broken into 1,000 pieces. When therefore the king's daughter had placed her stall in the street, by came the carts, and broke all she had into tiny fragments. She began to weep and said,
Alas, how shall I ever pay for the pots now?
The king had, however, wished by this to force her to marry the captain, but instead of that, she again went to the potter, and asked him if he would lend to her once more. He said, No, she must first pay for the things she had already had. Then she went to her father and cried and lamented, and said she would go forth into the world. Then said he,
I will have a little hut built for thee in the forest outside, and in it thou shalt stay all thy life long and cook for everyone, but thou shalt take no money for it.
When the hut was ready, a sign was hung on the door whereon was written, Today given, tomorrow sold. There she remained a long time, and it was rumored about the world that a maiden was there who cooked without asking for payment, and that this was set forth on a sign outside her door. The huntsman heard it likewise, and thought to himself,
That would suit thee. Thou art poor, and hast no money.
So he took his air gun and his knapsack, wherein all the things which he had formerly carried away with him from the castle as tokens of his truthfulness were still lying, and went into the forest, and found the hut with the sign, Today given, tomorrow sold. He had put on the sword with which he had cut off the heads of the three giants, and thus entered the hut, and ordered something to eat to be given to him. He was charmed with a beautiful maiden, who was indeed as lovely as any picture. She asked him whence he came and whither he was going, and he said,
I am roaming about the world.
Then she asked him where he had got the sword, for that truly her father's name was on it. He asked her if she were the king's daughter.
Yes,
Answered she.
With this sword,
Said he,
did I cut off the heads of 3 giants.
and he took their tongues out of his knapsack in proof. Then he also showed her the slipper, and the corner of the neck kerchief, and the bit of the nightdress. Hereupon she was overjoyed, and said that he was the one who had delivered her. On this they went together to the old king, and fetched him to the hut, and she led him into her room, and told him that the huntsman was the man who had really set her free from the giants. And when the aged king saw all the proofs of this, he could no longer doubt, and said that he was very glad he knew how everything had happened, and that the huntsman should have her to wife, on which the maiden was glad at heart. Then she dressed the huntsman as if he were a foreign lord, and the king ordered a feast to be prepared. When they went to table, the captain sat on the left side of the king's daughter, but the huntsman was on the right, and the captain thought he was a foreign lord who had come on a visit. When they had eaten and drunk, the old king said to the captain that he would set before him something which he must guess.
Supposing anyone said that he had killed the 3 giants, and he were asked where the giants' tongues were, and he were forced to go and look, and there were none in their heads, how could that happen?
The captain said,
Then they cannot have had any.
Not so.
Said the king,
Every animal has a tongue.
and then he likewise asked what anyone would deserve who made such an answer. The captain replied.
He ought to be torn in pieces.
Then the king said he had pronounced his own sentence, and the captain was put in prison and then torn in 4 pieces. But the king's daughter was married to the huntsman. After this he brought his father and mother, and they lived with their son in happiness, and after the death of the old king he received the kingdom. The protagonist of the story starts as a locksmith apprentice, but when he discovers a new interest in hunting, he has the courage to change his path and learn a new skill. The ability to adapt to new situations and pursue one's passions is a valuable lesson. The huntsman demonstrates resourcefulness and quick thinking when faced with challenges. For example, he marks the location of the distant light using his hat, uses his airgun skillfully to gain the giant's favor, and successfully outwits the giants to rescue the princess. The second fairy tale. The 2 kings' children. There was once on a time a king who had a little boy of whom it had been foretold that he should be killed by a stag when he was 16 years of age. And when he had reached that age, the huntsman once went hunting with him. In the forest, the king's son was separated from the others, and all at once he saw a great stag which he wanted to shoot but could not hit. At length he chased the stag so far that they were quite out of the forest, and then suddenly a great tall man was standing there instead of the stag, and said,
It is well that I have it. I have already ruined 6 pairs of glass skates with running after thee, and have not been able to get them.
Then he took the king's son with him, and dragged him through a great lake to a great palace, and then he had to sit down to table with him and eat something. When they had eaten something together, the king said,
I have 3 daughters. Thou must keep watch over the eldest for 1 night, from 9 in the evening till 6 in the morning. And every time the clock strikes, I will come myself and call. And if thou then givest me no answer, tomorrow morning thou shalt be put to death. But if thou always givest me an answer, thou shalt have her to wife.
When the young folks went to the bedroom, there stood a stone image of Street. Christopher, and the king's daughter said to it,
my father will come at 9 o'clock, and every hour till it strikes 3. When he calls, give him an answer instead of the king's son.
Then the stone image of Street. Christopher nodded its head quite quickly, and then more and more slowly till at last it stood still. The next morning the king said to him,
Thou hast done the business well, but I cannot give my daughter away. Thou must now watch a night by my second daughter, and then I will consider with myself whether thou canst have my eldest daughter to wife. But I shall come every hour myself, and when I call thee, answer me. And if I call thee and thou dost not reply, thy blood shall flow.
Then they both went into the sleeping room, and there stood a still larger stone image of Street. Christopher, and the king's daughter said to it,
If my father calls, do you answer him?
Then the great stone image of Street. Christopher again nodded its head quite quickly, and then more and more slowly, until at last it stood still again. And the king's son lay down on the threshold, put his hand under his head and slept. The next morning the king said to him,
Thou hast done the business really well, but I cannot give my daughter away. Thou must now watch a night by the youngest princess, and then I will consider with myself whether thou canst have my second daughter to wife. But I shall come every hour myself, and when I call thee, answer me. And if I call thee and thou answerest not, thy blood shall flow for me.
Then they once more went to the sleeping room together, and there was a much greater and much taller image of street, Christopher than the two first had been. The king's daughter said to it,
When my father calls, do thou answer.
Then the great tall stone image of street, Christopher nodded quite half an hour with its head, until at length the head stood still again. And the king's son laid himself down on the threshold of the door and slept. The next morning the king said,
Thou hast indeed watched well, but I cannot give thee my daughter now. I have a great forest. If thou cuttest it down for me between 6 o'clock this morning and 6 at night, I will think about it.
Then he gave him a glass axe, a glass wedge, and a glass mallet. When he got into the wood, he began at once to cut, but the axe broke in two. Then he took the wedge and struck it once with the mallet, and it became as short and as small as sand. Then he was much troubled and believed he would have to die, and sat down and wept. Now when it was noon the king said,
One of you girls must take him something to eat.
No,
said the two eldest.
we will not take it to him. The one by whom he last watched can take him something.
Then the youngest was forced to go and take him something to eat. When she got into the forest, she asked him how he was getting on.
Oh,
Said he.
I'm getting on very badly.
Then she said he was to come and just eat a little.
No,
Said he.
I cannot do that. I shall still have to die, so I will eat no more.
Then she spoke so kindly to him and begged him just to try, that he came and ate something. When he had eaten something she said,
I will comb thy hair a while, and then thou wilt feel happier.
So she combed his hair, and he became weary and fell asleep. And then she took her handkerchief and made a knot in it, and struck it 3 times on the earth, and said,
Earth workers, come forth.
In a moment, numbers of little earth men came forth, and asked what the king's daughter commanded. Then said she,
In 3 hours' time the great forest must be cut down, and the whole of the wood laid in heaps.
So the little earth men went about and got together the whole of their kindred to help them with the work. They began at once, and when the 3 hours were over, all was done. And they came back to the king's daughter and told her so. Then she took her white handkerchief again and said,
Earth workers, go home.
On this they all disappeared. When the king's son awoke, he was delighted, and she said,
Come home when it has struck 6 o'clock.
He did as she told him. And then the king asked,
Hast thou made away with the forest?
Yes,
said the king's son. When they were sitting at table, the king said,
I cannot yet give thee my daughter to wife. Thou must still do something more for her sake.
So he asked what it was to be. Then,
I have a great fish pond.
said the king,
Thou must go to it tomorrow morning and clear it of all mud until it is as bright as a mirror, and fill it with every kind of fish.
The next morning the king gave him a glass shovel and said,
The fish pond must be done by 6 o'clock.
So he went away. And when he came to the fish pond, he stuck his shovel in the mud and it broke in two. Then he stuck his hoe in the mud and broke it also. Then he was much troubled. At noon the youngest daughter brought him something to eat and asked him how he was getting on. So the king's son said everything was going very ill with him, and he would certainly have to lose his head.
my tools have broken to pieces again.
Oh,
Said she,
thou must just come and eat something, and then thou wilt be in another frame of mind.
No,
said he.
I cannot eat. I am far too unhappy for that.
Then she gave him many good words until at last he came and ate something. Then she combed his hair again, and he fell asleep. So once more she took her handkerchief, tied a knot in it, and struck the ground thrice with a knot, and said,
Earth workers, come forth.
In a moment a great many little earth men came and asked what she desired. and she told them that in 3 hours' time, they must have the fish pond entirely cleaned out, and it must be so clear that people could see themselves reflected in it, and every kind of fish must be in it. The little Earthmen went away and summoned all their kindred to help them, and in 2 hours it was done. Then they returned to her and said,
We have done as thou hast commanded.
The king's daughter took the handkerchief and once more struck thrice on the ground with it, and said,
Earth workers, go home again.
Then they all went away. When the king's son awoke, the fish pond was done. Then the king's daughter went away also, and told him that when it was 6 he was to come to the house. When he arrived at the house, the king asked,
Hast thou got the fish pond done?
Yes.
said the king's son. That was very good. When they were again sitting at table, the king said,
Thou hast certainly done the fish pond, but I cannot give thee my daughter yet. Thou must just do one thing more.
What is that, then?
asked the king's son. The king said he had a great mountain on which there was nothing but briars, which must all be cut down, and at the top of it the youth must build up a great castle, which must be as strong as could be conceived, and all the furniture and fittings belonging to a castle must be inside it. And when he arose next morning, the king gave him a glass axe and a glass gimlet with him, and he was to have all done by 6 o'clock. As he was cutting down the first briar with the axe, it broke off short, and so small that the pieces flew all round about, and he could not use the gimlet either. Then he was quite miserable, and waited for his dearest to see if she would not come and help him in his need. When it was midday, she came and brought him something to eat. He went to meet her and told her all, and ate something, and let her comb his hair and fell asleep. Then she once more took the knot and struck the earth with it, and said,
Earth workers, come forth.
Then came once again numbers of earthmen, and asked what her desire was. Then said she,
In the space of 3 hours they must cut down the whole of the briars, and a castle must be built on the top of the mountain that must be as strong as anyone could conceive, and all the furniture that pertains to a castle must be inside it.
They went away, and summoned their kindred to help them, and when the time was come, all was ready. Then they came to the king's daughter and told her so, and the king's daughter took her handkerchief and struck thrice on the earth with it, and said,
Earth workers, go home.
On which they all disappeared. When therefore the king's son awoke and saw everything done, he was as happy as a bird in air. When it had struck 6, they went home together. Then said the king,
Is the castle ready?
Yes.
said the king's son. When they sat down to table, the king said,
I cannot give away my youngest daughter until the 2 eldest are married.
Then the king's son and the king's daughter were quite troubled, and the king's son had no idea what to do. But he went by night to the king's daughter and ran away with her. When they had got a little distance away, the king's daughter peeped round and saw her father behind her.
Oh,
Said she,
what are we to do? My father is behind us, and will take us back with him. I will at once change thee into a briar, and myself into a rose, and I will shelter myself in the midst of the bush.
When the father reached the place, there stood a briar with 1 rose on it. Then he was about to gather the rose, when the thorn came and pricked his finger so that he was forced to go home again. His wife asked why he had not brought their daughter back with him. So he said he had nearly got up to her, but that all at once he had lost sight of her, and a briar with 1 rose was growing on the spot. Then said the queen,
If thou hadst but gathered the rose, the briar would have been forced to come to.
So he went back again to fetch the rose, but in the meantime the 2 were already far over the plain, and the king ran after them. Then the daughter once more looked round and saw her father coming, and said,
Oh, what shall we do now? I will instantly change thee into a church and myself into a priest, and I will stand up in the pulpit and preach.
When the king got to the place, there stood a church, and in the pulpit was a priest preaching. So he listened to the sermon, and then went home again. Then the queen asked why he had not brought their daughter with him, and he said,
No, I ran a long time after her, and just as I thought I should soon overtake her, a church was standing there and a priest was in the pulpit preaching.
Thou shouldst just have brought the priest,
said his wife.
and then the church would soon have come. It is no use to send thee. I must go there myself.
When she had walked for some time, and could see the two in the distance, the king's daughter peeped round and saw her mother coming, and said,
Now we are undone, for my mother is coming herself. I will immediately change thee into a fish pond and myself into a fish.
When the mother came to the place, there was a large fish pond, and in the midst of it a fish was leaping about and peeping out of the water, and it was quite merry. She wanted to catch the fish, but she could not. Then she was very angry, and drank up the whole pond in order to catch the fish, but it made her so ill that she was forced to vomit, and vomited the whole pond out again. Then she cried,
I see very well that nothing can be done now,
and said that now they might come back to her. Then the king's daughter went back again, and the queen gave her daughter 3 walnuts, and said,
With these thou canst help thyself when thou art in thy greatest need.
So the young folks went once more away together. And when they had walked quite 10 miles, they arrived at the castle from whence the king's son came, and close by it was a village. When they reached it, the king's son said,
Stay here, my dearest. I will just go to the castle, and then will I come with a carriage and with attendants to fetch thee.
When he got to the castle, they all rejoiced greatly at having the king's son back again. And he told them he had a bride who was now in the village, and they must go with the carriage to fetch her. Then they harnessed the horses at once, and many attendants seated themselves outside the carriage. When the king's son was about to get in, his mother gave him a kiss, and he forgot everything which had happened, and also what he was about to do. On this his mother ordered the horses to be taken out of the carriage again, and everyone went back into the house. But the maiden sat in the village and watched, and thought he would come and fetch her, but no one came. Then the king's daughter took service in the mill which belonged to the castle, and was obliged to sit by the pond every afternoon and clean the tubs. And the queen came one day on foot from the castle, and went walking by the pond, and saw the well-grown maiden sitting there, and said,
What a fine strong girl that is. She pleases me well.
Then she and all with her looked at the maid, but no one knew her. So a long time passed by, during which the maiden served the miller honorably and faithfully. In the meantime, the queen had sought a wife for her son, who came from quite a distant part of the world. When the bride came, they were at once to be married. And many people hurried together, all of whom wanted to see everything. Then the girl said to the miller that he might be so good as to give her leave to go also. So the miller said,
Yes, do go there.
When she was about to go, she opened one of the 3 walnuts, and a beautiful dress lay inside it. She put it on, and went into the church and stood by the altar. Suddenly came the bride and bridegroom, and seated themselves before the altar, and when the priest was just going to bless them, the bride peeped half round and saw the maiden standing there. Then she stood up again, and said she would not be given away until she also had as beautiful a dress as that lady there. So they went back to the house again, and sent to ask the lady if she would sell that dress. No, she would not sell it, but the bride might perhaps earn it. Then the bride asked her how she was to do this. Then the maiden said if she might sleep one night outside the king's son's door, the bride might have what she wanted. So the bride said,
Yes, she was willing to do that.
But the servants were ordered to give the king's son a sleeping drink. And then the maiden laid herself down on the threshold and lamented all night long. She had had the forest cut down for him. She had had the fish pond cleaned out for him. She had had the castle built for him. She had changed him into a briar, and then into a church, and at last into a fish pond, and yet he had forgotten her so quickly. The king's son did not hear one word of it, but the servants had been awakened, and had listened to it, and had not known what it could mean. The next morning when they were all up, the bride put on the dress, and went away to the church with the bridegroom. In the meantime the maiden opened the 2nd walnut, and a still more beautiful dress was inside it. She put it on, and went and stood by the altar in the church, and everything happened as it had happened the time before. And the maiden again lay all night on the threshold which led to the chamber of the king's son, and the servant was once more to give him a sleeping drink. The servant, however, went to him and gave him something to keep him awake, And then the king's son went to bed, and the miller's maiden bemoaned herself as before on the threshold of the door, and told of all that she had done. All this the king's son heard, and was sore troubled, and what was past came back to him. Then he wanted to go to her, but his mother had locked the door. The next morning, however, he went at once to his beloved, and told her everything which had happened to him, and prayed her not to be angry with him for having forgotten her. Then the king's daughter opened the third walnut, and within it was a still more magnificent dress, which she put on, and went with her bridegroom to church, and numbers of children came who gave them flowers, and offered them gay ribbons to bind about their feet. And they were blessed by the priest, and had a merry wedding. But the false mother and the bride had to depart. This is the end of the story. See you again tomorrow. Please like, share, subscribe to listen to more great fairy tales. Bye bye.